and welcome on behalf of the Partnership of Historic Bostons. My name is Sid Levitsky, and I'm Vice President of the Partnership. Please note that this event is being recorded and will appear on our website. First, a little background of who we are. The Partnership of Historic Bostons was first formed in 1999 as a joint project between the city of Boston, Massachusetts, and Boston, Lincolnshire, England, where many of the early Puritans emigrated from. The purpose of the partnership, as indicated by this evening's program, is public history. Each year, a specific aspect of 17th century Boston is chosen, and a program of lectures, tours, book, and document discussion groups is established. The formal lectures occur in the fall and are specified as Charter Day, which commemorates the naming of Boston, Dorchester, and Watertown on September 7th, 1630. This year's topic is entitled The Common Good, and the lecture topics will appear on the Partnership website in August of 2021. After the lecture this evening, we will have the opportunity for questions and discussion. I would ask everybody, except the speakers, to mute their computer so we won't have any noise in the background. This evening's lecturer is Eve LaPlante, a graduate of Princeton and Harvard, and an independent historian, and a well-known lecturer and published writer of numerous articles and 5 acclaimed books. Of her books, one of my favorites is American Jezebel, a biography of her ancestor Anne Hutchinson, a mother of 15 children, a midwife, and a self-styled female preacher who migrated to Boston in 1634 and was banished 3 years later as she attempted to become a public woman with outspoken independent ideas. My other favorite is her other ancestral biography entitled Salem Witch Judge, about Samuel Sewall, who was one of the 9 judges in 1692 that sent 20 women to death. Later in life, as his daughter lay dying, he had an epiphany about women's equal rights to a place in heaven, enumerated in his book entitled Talitha Cumi, Aramaic for Maiden, Arise, which is attached to the Sewall book. I'm pleased to introduce Eve LaPlante, whose lecture this evening is entitled Above Her Sex, the Problem of Public Women. Eve.
Here. Thank you, Sid. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. That's very nice introduction, and I'm always happy to work with the partnership. It's a great group. One of my favorite quotations, which I learned while writing American Jezebel, the biography I wrote of Anne Hutchinson, is from a historian named Amy Schrager Lang, who writes about women's roles in American history. This is the quote: "The problem of Anne Hutchinson is the problem of the public woman." What exactly is the problem of the public woman? The problem is the term itself, public woman. That's an oxymoron. In early America, a public woman did not exist. I'm not talking about prostitution. I'm talking about a woman who has a formal public role in society as a leader. Women in 17th century New England could not teach in public or speak in public. They could not lead, neither as governors, nor judges, nor ministers. They could not vote. They could not serve as soldiers. They could not hold property in their own name. They could not sign a legal document. Why were women not permitted to do all these things? Because to a 17th century mind, women are naturally inferior to men. Women have no capacity for reason or deep thought. The rare woman who achieved anything in a male domain was said by Mary Astle to have acted above her sex. She was a man in petticoats. To quote an English clergyman, Thomas Gisborne, legislation, jurisprudence, political economy, government in all of its executive functions, erudition, and commercial enterprise are all pursuits and occupations assigned to men. They demand the efforts of a mind endued with the powers of close and comprehensive reasoning, which women lack. A philosopher then, Malebranche, explained that women are, quote, incapable of penetrating to truths that are slightly difficult to discover. Everything abstract is incomprehensible to them because of the delicacy of their brain fibers, close quote. So the native irrationality and powerlessness of women comes down to neurology, which some people call neurosexism. I'm just trying to figure out how do I make my picture of myself not be just huge? Is there a way to do that?
No, I don't know.
Okay, it just shifted over. That's fine. It doesn't matter. So these ideas about women's capacities or lack thereof were widely held. Virtually everyone accepted them as true, including women. And these ideas persisted. A century ago, women still couldn't vote. 50 years ago, no woman had ever served on the Supreme Court. A handful had served in Congress. And now, nearly 400 years into the American experiment, only about 20% of our national legislature is female, and that's a historic high. Fewer than 5% of major American corporations have women at their helms. Men, who make up slightly less than half of the population, have served as president 45 times. No woman ever has. The sole female major party candidate for president was met with crowds of Americans crying, "Lock her up, hang her," as if she were a witch. Which brings us back to the 17th century, when women had no formal public power. But there were certain kinds of power held by women: private powers, domestic powers, even some educational and religious powers within their own homes and other women's homes. Women taught younger women and children how to read and understand the Bible. Women raised children and crops. They cared for land and gardens and complex households. They grew herbs used as medicines. They healed the sick and they cared for the wounded. Women's greatest realm of power was childbirth, the unique time when men were excluded. Midwifery was an exclusively female domain. Birth itself is dramatic and significant, especially in an era then when many women and babies died soon after birth. Although powerless in public, women were nevertheless charged with saving the lives of the wives and children of New England's most powerful men. John Winthrop, the governor who led the move to banish Anne Hutchinson. When he did so, he'd recently welcomed her into his home to deliver his baby and tend to his wife. Quote, women provided a large part of the medical care in early colonial New England, the historian Rebecca Tannenbaum wrote, which tied them to all parts of their communities and gave them access to social and legal authority. But even that power held by women serving as domestic healers and medical practitioners held dangers. The 17th century had its own special concept of medical malpractice. If a birth resulted in a dead mother, which was common, or a dead or deformed infant, which was also shockingly common to us today, the midwife could be held accountable. And if a monstrous birth occurred, that term monstrous birth covered any bad outcome, such as stillbirth, a birth defect, or any physical abnormality, then it had to be someone's fault, either the parents or the attending midwives. People in early Boston, as in early modern Europe, considered a monstrous birth a sign of sin in someone near the infant. So a midwife who attended at a monstrous birth was often seen as an ally of the devil, a witch. So you can see the association between midwives and witchcraft and female power. And there's the paradox. The unique realm of power held by women as private healers bled into their public role as witches. As an example of this phenomenon, let's look at Anne Hutchinson, who, in addition to being a religious leader, was a midwife, a skill that she had learned from her mother. Anne was born in Lincolnshire, England, on the middle eastern coast of England in 1591 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, one of the rare women in human history to rule an imperial power. Anne was the daughter of a midwife named Dryden, a cousin of the poet laureate, and a rebellious Puritan minister named Marbury, who also taught his gifted daughter his skills, interpreting and teaching scripture. Anne grew up to be both a midwife and a kind of female preacher, teaching other women about their faith and the Bible in her home, which in Puritan England was an acceptable activity for a high status woman. Anne continued both of these activities, midwifery and teaching other women about scripture, in Boston, Massachusetts, where she moved with her husband and 12 of her children in 1634. The Bible talks that she regularly gave in her parlor in Boston were so popular with women that they soon attracted the women's husbands, and they numbered as many as 80 attendees, including influential people, men like Sir Henry Vane, a young immigrant who defeated the colony's founder, John Winthrop, in the race for governor in 1636. Winthrop was greatly threatened by the growing evidence of Anne's power. At this point, in 1636, she'd only been in Boston for 2 years. In 1637, after Winthrop figured out a way to get reelected governor, he called her before the colonial court on a charge of heresy for behaving in a manner, quote, not fitting for her sex, close quote. It was, he said, not tolerable for a woman to teach men, Winthrop scolded her. During 2 days of interrogation by him in the court in a meeting house in what's now Harvard Square, Anne defended herself brilliantly, but her 40 male judges, faced with a perceived threat to public order, banished her and sent her to prison until she could leave. A few weeks before that trial, Anne had been present at a so-called monstrous birth. A young woman named Mary Dyer, who I'm sure you've heard of for her later activities, had been having a difficult birth. So the midwife who was attending her, Jane Hawkins, had sent for Anne Hutchinson, hoping she could help. The baby girl born to Mary and William Dyer had a condition that's now known as anencephaly. Her brain was undeveloped, and she died soon after birth. Mistresses Hawkins and Hutchinson and the Reverend John Cotton, who had also been called on for help, decided to bury the baby's body secretly to prevent the Dyers from the public shame that naturally followed a monstrous birth. People gossiped about the baby, of course, and Governor Winthrop eventually heard about it. He couldn't question Anne Hutchinson or Mary Dyer. Anne was already in exile on Rhode Island, where the Dyers and many other Bostonians had voluntarily followed her. But Winthrop ordered that Mistress Hawkins be questioned. Quote, many things were observable in the birth and discovery of this monster, the governor reported. The Dyers were heretics, he could tell, and the midwife Hawkins was notorious for familiarity with the devil. All the women present at the birth, he wrote, were suddenly taken with such a violent vomiting. Others had their children taken with convulsions. At such time as the child died, the bed wherein the mother lay shook violently. Winthrop also ordered that the corpse be exhumed and examined to determine what exactly it meant. So the child was taken up from its grave and revealed as a 17th century version of Rosemary's Baby. In Winthrop's own words, quote, "A woman child, a fish, a beast and a fowl, all woven together in one, and without a head, though much corrupted, yet the horns and claws and holes in the back. And some scales were found. It was so monstrous and misshapen as the like has scarce been heard of. The ears were like an ape's and grew upon the shoulders. The nose was hooking upward. The breast and back was full of sharp prickles. The back parts were on the side. Instead of toes, it had upon each foot 3 claws with talons like a young fowl. Upon the back, it had 2 great holes like mouths, and in each of them stuck out a piece of flesh. It had no forehead, but in the place thereof, above the eyes, 4 horns, 2 above an inch long, hard and sharp," close quote. This truly was a monstrous birth, but it didn't entirely make sense to Governor Winthrop because Mistress Dyer had been such a proper, comely woman, he wrote. And then he remembered how close Mistress Dyer had been with Mistress Hutchinson, so close that the Dyers were among the group of Bostonians who were now on Rhode Island with Anne, where she'd gone after being banished. So maybe it did make sense. Monstrous errors like Hutchinson's begat monstrous births like Dyer's. One reason that Anne was such a threat to the governor was her work as a medical practitioner. He had earlier described her in his journal as a woman very helpful in the times of childbirth and other occasions of bodily infirmities, and well furnished with the means for these purposes, who readily insinuated herself into the affections of many. Her medical skills gave her real power. Her mentor, whom she had been close with in England and also in Massachusetts, had observed that at Anne's first coming, well, as Mistress Hutchinson's first coming to Boston, she was well respected and esteemed of me. I heard she did much good in our town, in women's meetings, at child travails, wherein she was not only skillful and helpful, but she readily fell into good discourse with the women about their spiritual estates. According to Cotton, Anne Hutchinson had more people resort to her for counsel about matters of conscience and clearing up men's spiritual estates than any minister. That was quite a lot to say. Another source of her authority was her remarkable skill as a mother. Having married William Hutchinson in Lincolnshire at the age of 21, she proceeded to bear 15 healthy infants, mostly in England. Her firstborn, Edward, came in 1613, Susan in 1614, Richard in 1616, Faith in 1617, Bridget in 1619, Francis in 1620, Elizabeth in 1622, William in 1623, Samuel in 1624, Anne in 1626, Mary in 1628, Catherine in 1630. Catherine, interestingly, is the Catherine whose privy was dug up in the North End in the Big Dig. And there was a great exhibit of that in the Commonwealth Museum some years ago. Catherine Nanny Naylor was her married name. You might have heard of her. Anyway, there was a second William then, because the first had died in 1631, and a second Susan, who died of the plague in England in 1633. And in 1636, in Boston, in the family's new home here, Anne gave birth to a boy named Zuriel. A year later, at the time of her trial, she was 46 years old and pregnant for the 16th time. In the course of that pregnancy, Anne endured 2 public trials, because there was the court trial, which I described, and then a few months later, there was also the church trial where she was formally excommunicated from the church, the first church in Boston. Then she spent a winter apart from her family under arrest in Roxbury. She was banished and excommunicated, and she walked the 60 miles from Boston to Rhode Island. And there, in exile, she delivered what appeared to be a monstrous birth. It was actually a late-term miscarriage known in modern medical parlance as a molar pregnancy or a hydatidiform mole, which is a well-recognized gynecological condition that's now removed soon after detection so that it doesn't become cancerous. And I believe Anne Hutchinson's hydatidiform mole may be the first recorded such condition. Then, though, it was a wondrous sign of Anne's inherent evil, more divine proof that she had been justly expelled. Reports of her abnormal birth arrived in Boston courtesy of a young Rhode Island minister who saw her after her delivery, when she nearly died from blood loss. When the Reverend Cotton in Boston, Anne's former theological ally, heard of her unnatural birth, he made use of it in public at the next lecture day, choosing this medical matter, which seems to us intensely private, as his text on which to preach. It was, he told his congregation, a likely sign of Mistress Hutchinson's error and heresy. Anne's miscarriage became the talk of Boston. Winthrop wrote to the minister in Rhode Island to request a fuller account of her monstrous birth, and he recorded what he heard. And this is a quote from his journal. Mistress Hutchinson, being big with child and growing toward the time of her labor, brought forth not one, as Mistress Dyer did, but, which was more strange to amazement, 30 monstrous births or thereabout at once. Some of them as far as I could ever learn of human shape. But see how the wisdom of God fitted this judgment to her sin every way. For look, as she had vented misshapen opinions in number, so many monsters, and as those were public and not in a corner mentioned, so this is now come to be known and famous over all these churches and a great part of the world. Close quote. In 17th century Boston, the contents of a woman's uterus were the subject of religious and political debate. Gynecological conditions were a sign of God's intervention in the world, exposing people's sins. Women's bodies were subjects for men to preach about and pick apart for their religious and social meaning. Were there other uses of the female body in the Puritan mind? Well, yes, reproduction was the main purpose of a woman's body, Puritans believed. Once that earthly function was fulfilled, though, women became irrelevant in contrast to men whose bodies are resurrected after death. This is standard theology. The Reverend Cotton Mather, a grandson of the Reverend John Cotton, explained that after death, the souls of male saints escape their worldly bodies to assume a heavenly body that includes organs. There was intense debate among 17th century ministers about exactly which organs of the male body are resurrected. And this body allows these men to see and hear as they float alongside angels who are also male. In Puritan theology, heaven is an entirely masculine place. Which leads me to a hopeful note, which Sid mentioned slightly, which arises unexpectedly from the Salem witchcraft crisis of 1692. In that crisis, during which the Massachusetts court, the same court as the one that had tried Anne Hutchinson 60 years earlier, the court tried hundreds of people, men and women, for witchcraft, and they executed 20 innocent people. But it also had some positive outcomes. Among them, the creation of the first independent judiciary in the Western Hemisphere, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, which was formed as a direct consequence of the witchcraft crisis. Another positive outcome of the witch hunt was a change of heart within one of the 9 judges on the court, a man named Samuel Sewall. 4 years after the trials, in 1696, Sewall called for a public fast day of repentance, and he stood up in his church, Boston's Third, to acknowledge his shame and blame for killing innocent people. The fact of Sewall's repentance is well known, as is the fact that when 1 in 5 Bostonians owned slaves, Sewall wrote the first anti-slavery tract in American history, which he published in 1700. Less well known is what Sewall did nearly 30 years later, when, as an old man, he considered the possibility that women are equal to men. It was the summer of 1724. Sewall, at that point, I think he was 72, I'm pretty sure. And he was retired from the court. He was spending long hours at the bedside of his oldest daughter while waiting on my dear child in her last sickness, as he put it. And her name was Hannah. That was the same name as his first wife. When Hannah fell asleep, her father read. And he did all he could do to help her, sitting with her, praying, and singing songs. But occasionally she was asleep. So one of the books that he read that summer was called The British Apollo. It was the sort of book you keep in your guest bedroom. It contained 2,000 answers to curious questions in most arts and sciences, approved of by many of the most learned and ingenious of both universities and of the Royal Society. Sewall read some of the British Apollo, which was published in London in 1711, aloud to Hannah. But on page 200, he came to a question that seemed unsuitable for sharing with her. And the question was, quote, "Is there now, or will there be at the resurrection, any females in heaven?" Close quote. This was a relevant question according to the text, since there seems to be no need of them there. The British Apollo's reply to the question was, quote, "Since sexes are corporal distinctions, it follows that there can be now no distinction of sex in heaven. Our rising bodies will not be distinguished into sexes. In the resurrection, the dead are as the angels of God," that is, male. Well, this malapert question troubled Samuel Sewall. The embedded assumption, since there seems to be no need of them there, especially irritated him. In his view, quote, "It is most certain there will be no needless, impertinent persons or things in heaven, because heaven is a roomy, magnificent palace furnished with the most rich and splendid entertainments," close quote. So many of the women that Sewall had loved were dead. He felt sure that God is their father too, and therefore heaven is their country too. He saw no convincing evidence that women's bodies were less likely to be resurrected than men's, although this was the teaching of his church. So the judge took up an old diary. He wrote diaries for most of his life, like many educated Puritans, and he began to address the issue of, quote, "whether the bodies of women deceased shall be again raised up," and remain in their own sex, close quote. He titled his work Talitha Cumi. That's an Aramaic expression in the Gospel of Mark that means maiden, arise. And Jesus uses it with a young girl who's died. He visits the home of the girl, and the parents are very upset. Their daughter's died, and he goes in and speaks to the dead girl. He says, Talitha Cumi, and she returns to life. Sewall used the same research methods that he'd acquired at Harvard College in the 1630s to write what he was going to write. He gathered additional texts, including works of Augustine and Calvin, and he stated his thesis, quote, "He that instituted both sexes will restore both in heaven." He wrote, "Is there no need for a daughter to go and see her father when he sends for her? Is there no need for her to see God, who, though he be a great king, yet is a most loving, tender-hearted father?" Need isn't relevant, Sewall concluded. Quote, "God has no need of any creature," close quote. Augustine and Erasmus provided plain, undeniable proof that women have an equal share in the resurrection, noting the beautiful variety with which God has been pleased to adorn his works. Samuel Sewall wrote, "It's past dispute that in the resurrected world, Mary shall enjoy her body and John shall enjoy his." Then Sewall went so far as to invoke the concept of the, quote, "right of women," close quote, which was remarkable 2 centuries before women could vote. He wrote, "If any controversy be moved injurious to the right of women, in my opinion, so many women are such good lawyers and of such quick understanding, they have no reason to be afraid of lacking rights." Well, as you can imagine, while the slavery essay he wrote in 1700 was, copies were saved, people talked about it, it existed in the world, none of Sewall's early descendants or friends or colleagues saw fit to save a copy of the printed version of Talitha Cumi. So most historians assumed that this late essay on gender equality was never published. The funny thing is, in January of 1625, Samuel Sewall recorded in a ledger that he paid £2 to the printer Bartholomew Green for printing and folding 3 half-sheets Talitha Cumi. So it was published, but no one else commented on it, and no copy of the 24-page octavo is known to survive. However, at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which holds a vast trove of Samuel Sewall's papers, you can find the draft of Talitha Cumi in his original diary, the version he would have handed to the printer. And the text, as Sid said, the text of Talitha Cumi, that the English part of it, there's a lot of Latin and Greek I wasn't able to include, but the English part of Talitha Cumi is at the back of Salem Witch Judge, my biography of Sewall, so that you can see for yourself how a Salem witch judge transformed himself into an early proponent of equal rights for women, taking one step forward in the long battle over women's bodies. That's my talk, and I would be happy to have discussion or whatever would be good.
Thank you so much, Eve, for this really exciting lecture. We have time for some questions. Please type your name and questions in the chat box, and I'll try to get as many as I can. As you think about the questions, I'm going to start with the provocative issue, which you raised regarding the Puritans' concept that heaven was reserved only for men. Could you tell us the origins of that within Puritan thinking? When did it enter into the church? And was it finally expurgated, or did it remain within the church?
Well, I have to say that I did not explore the Puritan view of that, except that it was the standard belief. But I mean, all of Puritan theology, which can get quite dense, is deals with this issue of the resurrection of the body, and it comes really out of the resurrection of Christ, that in heaven, as described in, Revelation and in parts of the New Testament, the bodies of the saints are resurrected as bodies. So in the Puritan interpretation of it, they were, as you know, Puritans were very focused on the second coming of Christ. I mean, Sewall was so focused on it. He wrote an essay in 1637 describing exactly where Jesus Christ would return at his second coming, and basically saying it was most likely he was going to come to Plum Island because that was the best place. And it's a wonderful description of Plum Island and why that would be the one place where Jesus Christ would step back on earth. Now, many people had thought in earlier theology it would be Jerusalem, or, one of the great cities of the world, but, no one knew. So Sewall thought it was Plum Island. The Puritans were constantly trying to figure out, when is it? Well, it's coming soon. And it was a big part of their life, and people would predict it, and then the date would pass and it hadn't happened. So people had to keep revising it. But the notion of the resurrection of the body, I think, comes not only for Puritans out of the New Testament. And that's just what they believed. I think it's that the idea was that nobody worried about whether women's bodies were there. And as you read in that British publication, which was probably just the standard view of people at the time, that the bodies, just as the angels are all male, the bodies of the humans that are somehow resurrected in this new place are all going to be male bodies, because those are really, other than reproduction, which you don't need anymore in heaven, those are the only bodies that you would need. So I think that's where ultimately the idea comes from.
I'm going to follow that up with one more question and then let everyone else go. And that, did heaven include a space for the praying Indians and the converted Black slaves who were males, or is that not discussed?
To my knowledge, I mean, on the one hand, it would be presumed that the male bodies would be there. There were, as you know, there were praying Indians. Sewall was not your typical Puritan, but he had all these young Native American boys that he brought into his home and then sent off to Harvard in the 80s and 90s. And presumably their bodies would be resurrected. But I don't know specifically if people were writing that. I'm just presuming that the male bodies were the ones that they were thinking about.
Okay, I have a question here from a Jen Diedrich, and I wonder if she could unmute herself.
Yes. It's Dederick, Jen Dederick.
Okay, and please ask your question, Jen.
I wanted to know what the Puritan view on the Virgin Mary was, and what role did she play in the theology, if at all? Was she too Catholic for them? And of course, I'm not even going to ask about Mary Magdalene, because I'm assuming she's ignored all completely. But is there the idea of her being, the vessel of God and all of that? Like, how did they rationalize ignoring all of that?
I've never seen her mentioned, but immediately it comes to mind that the idea of the saints, of having these church saints that you honor, is very Catholic. And to the Puritan mind, the people who are members of the church were saints. So it's a very different view of sanctity. So I suspect that, it would be considered idolatrous, certainly to make a statue of Mary and worship it, or any kind of, effigy or anything. But I don't, Sewall did say in Talitha Cumi, he said, in the resurrected world, Mary shall enjoy her body and John shall enjoy his. Now, maybe he's thinking of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and John the Baptist, or John the apostle, but we don't really know. So I don't think they worshiped Mary in the way that we think of as the Catholic way. So, and I would presume that her body wouldn't be resurrected, because we don't really need it if Jesus Christ is resurrected. I mean, it's the same idea. That's what I'm imagining. I've literally never, I don't know if anyone else can recall, can't recall any particular mention of her, except in talking about, sections of the gospel where she appears. But it's very, very different from this Catholic idea of worshiping Mary.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lynn Benson has a comment that she wants to make. She's a member of First Church. Lynn, could you unmute yourself, please? Well, if you can't unmute, so sometimes it's a little awkward, I'll just read her comment. She said, my husband, John, and I, and we know John Benson, he's on the board of the partnership, are members of the First Church in Boston. And several years ago, we had a ceremony to welcome Anne Hutchinson back into the congregation. Do you want to have any comment, Eve, about that?
Yeah, that was, they did that not too long ago. And they unexcommunicated her. And Michael Dukakis, when he was governor, John Winthrop's, descendant, whatever you call that relationship, he, in 1987, he unbanished her. He welcomed her back to citizenship of Massachusetts. And, I think there's no question that she's considered a, very important founding mother at this time. The statue of her in front of the State House we're actually doing some work, John Morrison and some people at the Chester Dallin Museum and I and others are trying to figure out the history of that statue, but that was made in around 1920, and the Boston Public Library didn't want it. The state accepted it, but the legislature never wanted to dedicate it because there was controversy about it. And then it was finally dedicated in 2005. But clearly there were people who felt strongly about making a statue of Anne Hutchinson 100 years ago.
Okay. Nancy Taylor has a comment. Can you unmute yourself, Nancy?
I put something in what was the comment?
An essay about Native American souls.
All right. So yeah, Sewall also wrote an essay asserting that Native Americans have souls, which is a horrible thing to even say, but was apparently a big deal at the time.
Yeah, and Sewall was much more liberal than the average Puritan on that sort of thing, and much more expansive in his theology. That's the same essay that he wrote when he talked about the second coming occurring on Plum Island.
Okay, Pamela Bible wanted me to read her question rather than she reading it herself. It states, for those of us who don't know, could you tell us more about how and why the Hutchinsons came to Massachusetts, and then post-banishment, how Anne's life in Rhode Island played out?
Well, as you may know, a lot of the Puritans were struggling in the 1620s, losing their political power, and the church was sort of leaning more to the Catholic side of Anglicanism, and the Archbishop was pressuring a lot of the Puritan ministers. And I mean, that had been going on for a while, but Anne Hutchinson's father was he was imprisoned for his Puritan preaching and challenging of the bishop when she was a little girl for a number of years. And then he sort of came back in the favor of the church under James I. But then John Cotton and most of the Puritan ministers who came to New England in the 1630s were running afoul of the authorities of the Church of England, and they were being silenced, and they were being dragged into court, and they were having to hide or go to some other place in the world. And Anne was living in the midst of this, and she was basically like John Cotton's right hand. John Cotton was, I call him the Mick Jagger of Puritan England. He was the very, very influential Puritan preacher who was preaching in Boston of Lincolnshire, which is a town in Lincolnshire, which Boston, Massachusetts was named for. And Anne and her husband would go to Boston, which was about a several-hour trip by horseback. And then they would listen to Cotton preach, and then she would basically help Cotton teach. That's why he said she had such influence, even over men, helping them with their spiritual estates. And Cotton himself had been very cleverly able to elude the authorities for a while. But in 1633, the Court of High Commission sent soldiers to bring him to London to be tried. And he had already gone into hiding because he had been warned that he was in trouble. And so he then came with his young wife, and they were about to have their first child in 1633. And so I think this was the prompter for Anne Hutchinson to come. I mean, her husband was a wealthy mercer. They were well established. They'd lived in Alford. She'd spent some time in London when she was growing up, but they'd lived in Alford mostly all of their lives in Lincolnshire. They had this huge family and lots of family on both sides. And I think they probably didn't particularly want to move, but after John Cotton moved, Anne decided to follow. And also her brother-in-law, John Wheelwright, was the only other, Puritan minister who was left at that point. And then he also followed, and he came as well. So, I think she was motivated by Cotton's trip across the ocean. She came in 1634, and then she was here for 3 years, little over 3 years. And they imprisoned her over the winter after they tried her in the court, and then she was excommunicated. And then she walked with 50 or 70 followers to Rhode Island. And her husband and older sons and male supporters had all arranged, apparently through the Reverend Roger Williams, to purchase from the Narragansett Indians the island, Rhode Island, which is now Newport and Portsmouth, Rhode Island. And because she had been banished, they all had to move. They chose to move. And she couldn't purchase any land because she was a woman. So they went and they created a more rudimentary settlement on a beach in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. And she joined them there. And they created a community there. And for a while, apparently her husband, Will Hutchinson, was governor. He wasn't at all interested in public power. And apparently she continued teaching there and preaching in a sense. I'm not sure she would have called it preaching, but certainly it was teaching. And then, and the only bad thing was that the Massachusetts Bay Colony authorities kept pestering her, and they would send messengers to tell her husband, oh, she has to come back and apologize. And so that was a little scary. And there were some threats that Massachusetts was going to take over Rhode Island by force, which, Rhode Island was a more free-thinking community than Massachusetts. And because there were other outsiders, people like Roger Williams, who had gone there even before her. And then the saddest thing was that in 1642, 4 years after they arrived in Rhode Island, William Hutchinson died. Now, at this point, Anne is only 50 years old. And she has still very young, her youngest children were like 5 and 8 years old, something like that. And she's feeling very threatened by Massachusetts Bay Colony. Without William Hutchinson's support, she was much more threatened. And so she decided to take her family to the Bronx to live with the Dutch. She got permission to do that, and they sailed to the Bronx, and she had arranged for a small farmhouse to be built along what is now the Hutchinson River Parkway and along the river there. And she went there with her youngest, 7 or 8 of her younger children. Some of them were, teenagers, a married teenage daughter and a few teenage sons. So she had like quite a bit of support from some young adults and some servants, I believe. And then after about a year there, the Dutch were engaging in a war with the Seminole Indians. It was a 5-year war, and they would each go through and kill a few Dutch and then kill a few Native Americans, and back and forth. So these retaliatory raids. And the Dutch said to her that they all abandoned their little settlement, and they said, you really should leave because the Indians are coming. And no one exactly knows why she didn't leave with all of her children, but she had always been very opposed to the idea of killing Native Americans, which was pretty much what a lot of people thought was the right thing to do then in that community. And she had opposed the enlisting of young men to fight in the Pequot War. So perhaps she felt that she wouldn't threaten the Native Americans, but when the Indians, came in to rampage the Dutch village that she was living in, they probably couldn't tell her. She didn't look any different than a Dutch woman. And so all of the young adults, men, females, all of the little children, except one girl, they were all, and Anne Hutchinson, they were all murdered, scalped, and their bodies were dragged into the house, and the house with the cattle, and the house was burned down, which was standard. And then the chief of the Seminole Indians discovered, as they were leaving, they discovered a 9-year-old girl hiding inside the split rock, which you can see alongside the New England Thruway, and in the northern Bronx. And it was just above their house. This little house that she'd had built was right there. And the little girl, Susan, the youngest daughter, had been supposedly picking blueberries at the time of the massacre. So she wasn't seen. And by the time the whole thing was over, she had basically witnessed the massacre of her family, but she hid inside the rock. And then the Native American men found her, and they took her with them. That was pretty standard to take a young girl. And they raised her for the next 8 years. And she knew their language, and she was completely part of the culture. And the chief, this man, I think his name was Wampage, he changed his name to Anhoke because, in honor of Anne, because he felt terrible once he discovered, probably from Susan Hutchinson, who he just killed, that he would have ever killed this woman who had been such a strong leader in English America. And he'd heard of her. And so he was horrified to find out she wasn't some Dutch woman. So basically, it's a very sad end of the story, but that's what happened at the end.
Thank you. That's a great story. During that time that the indigenous people attacked Anne Hutchinson, the Dutch military were going up and down the Hudson River, destroying Indian villages and killing them. So it was sort of a tit for tat. They were trying to protect themselves. So it wasn't something that just came out of the blue.
And even more so, they were actually, it was a funny thing because they were warning the Dutch, we're coming. And then they went, it's like, announcing your arrival in this battle back and forth. And they probably wouldn't have killed anyone if the Hutchinsons hadn't been there, because the Dutch all left. So it was a funny kind of a back and forth, and it went on for 5 years.
Just terrible. We have another question from Rosabelle Guzman. Could you turn your microphone on? I don't know whether you're able to do it, so I'm going.
She says she can't.
Oh,
Good.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You had a question? Roosevelt? We see your face.
Oh, here, she doesn't have a mic, she says.
Okay, it's a little red dot at the bottom left.
I think we need to read her question for her.
I'll read it. What inspired Sewall to send boys you mentioned to college? And what became of these boys?
Well,
These
they
are
were
the
Indian.
These are Native American children.
Yeah, they were I think they were teenage boys, probably like 10 to 15 years old. And there were a number of them. And I think it was his way of basically reaching out to them and trying to include them in this new settlement and Christianity and higher education and all of the things that, you know, he was giving his own sons, if he could. I mean, one of his sons became a minister and graduated from Harvard. And that he wanted to include Native American sons in that as well. He was very close to the thinking of the Reverend John Eliot. And so, but I think it was probably unusual that he took a number of Native American youths into his home. I don't know if maybe other Puritans did it, I don't know, but it seems like it sort of fits more with his philosophy. By the way, that the people are asking about Plum Island. The Plum Island he was talking about was in Newbury, Massachusetts, in the Great Marsh. And it was where he came as a boy of 9 when he first came to America. And he just thought it was the most beautiful place on earth. And that's why he thought Jesus Christ would choose it.
Okay, I think we've run out of questions. I'm very grateful for your wonderful talk. I want everyone to remember that the partnership is a 501c3 not-for-profit all-volunteer organization with no paid staff. It depends on public financial support to fund our costs associated with these activities. You could donate to the partnership by going to our website and pressing the red donate button. I think it's going to work. Over the next day, you will be receiving a survey regarding this evening's lecture. Please fill it out so that we can determine if the partnership is meeting your needs regarding our mission of public history. Thank you all for participating this evening. Thank you, Eve, for a spectacular lecture, and good night to all. Thank you.
You're welcome.